Your life is being priced through one strip of water. And right now, war is turning it into leverage. Ships are slowing. Insurance is breaking. Governments are opening emergency reserves. So what happens when the world's lifeline doesn't have to close to start choking it? Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just geography. It is a machine, a pressure valve, a pricing system, a global dependency disguised as a shipping lane. It connects producers, insurers, traders, ports, refineries, and governments into one nervous system. And when one part of that system flinches, the rest starts shaking too. Around 1/5 of the world's oil and petroleum moves through it. Around 1/5 of the world's LNG trade moves through it too. That means factories, airlines, grids, freight, fertilizers, plastics, food systems, and entire governments feel it. That also means a local threat can become a global cost before headlines catch up. And that is what makes this war bigger than Iran. Because the first thing to understand is simple. Hormuz does not need headlines to matter. It only needs traffic. It only needs ships to keep moving on time and at scale. Every day, tankers pass through that narrow corridor, carrying energy toward Asia, Europe, and beyond. Those ships do not carry comfort. They carry continuity. Those ships are not abstract. They are time. They are fuel. They are electricity delayed by miles and hours and fear. They are supply chains staying alive one safe transit at a time. And once war touches that lane, distance stops protecting anyone. A refinery in Asia can feel it. A utility in Europe can feel it. A supermarket thousands of kilometers away can feel it later. That is why this conflict stopped being regional almost immediately. The missiles mattered. The strikes mattered. But the deeper shock came from what happened next. Ships started hesitating. Insurers started recalculating. Markets started searching for a price that no longer existed. And all three were reacting to uncertainty more than outright closure. And when price breaks, order usually breaks with it. That is the real Dominion story here. Because most people think power looks like armies, flags, and speeches. But modern power often looks smaller than that, quieter than that, more technical than that. A form signed in London, a route delayed in the Gulf, a risk model rewritten overnight, a captain told to wait instead of sail, a buyer told to pay more instead of ask questions. That is how a war enters your life before you notice it. Marine insurers began canceling war risk coverage as the conflict widened. Premiums that had been around 0.25% rose as high as 3% of vessel value. That is not a detail. That is a shock multiplier. Because insurance sits underneath movement, like invisible infrastructure. You do not notice it until it starts failing. Because when insurance explodes, transport costs rise. When transport costs rise, energy costs rise. Almost everything downstream gets hit. Fuel first, then freight, then inputs, then prices, then politics. And that chain moves faster than people expect. It also spreads farther than people expect. Because shipping is not only about oil arriving, it is about contracts holding. It is about timing holding. It is about the market believing delivery is still real. At one point, around 1,000 ships were in the Gulf region. About 500 were oil and gas tankers. At least 3 tankers were damaged early in the escalation. A seafarer was killed. Around 150 ships were stranded near Hormuz. That is not just disruption. That is a warning shot to the entire system. Because now, every remaining ship becomes part of the calculation. That is when the story changes. Because now the problem is no longer supply in theory. Now the problem is movement in practice. And systems do not break only when production disappears. They break when cargo becomes uncertain, when schedules collapse, when buyers stop trusting delivery dates, when governments stop trusting the market, when every shipment carries an extra layer of doubt. That is where this war became global. Not because everyone joined it, because everyone was already exposed to it. Exposure is the real map here. Not alliance maps, not ideology maps, dependency maps. Asia is especially exposed because Gulf energy still anchors huge parts of its supply chain. Europe is less directly dependent than before, but still vulnerable to prolonged shock. Importers do not need equal exposure to suffer together. They only need the same corridor to become unreliable. And that matters, because a shock does not need equal exposure. It only needs enough concentration, enough dependence, enough bottlenecks. And Hormuz gives you all three. This is where the first illusion collapses. Most people imagine the worst-case scenario as full closure, a total blockade, a complete shutdown, a single dramatic moment, a clean image, a simple headline. But that is not actually the most dangerous version. The more dangerous version is messier, harder to photograph, harder to resolve, partial disruption, threat without certainty, passage without trust, movement without confidence. Because a system under permanent doubt can bleed longer than a system under outright siege. It can also bleed without ever triggering one final dramatic image. That is the midpoint of this story. The danger is not only that Hormuz closes. The danger is that the world starts behaving as if it might. That is enough to reprice risk, enough to freeze decisions, enough to pull inventories lower even under a ceasefire. It is enough to make buyers pay for fear, not only for barrels. Citi said global oil stocks could still fall by about 900 million barrels even if a ceasefire is extended. That number matters for one reason. It tells you the damage is not just event-driven, it is structural. It is moving through storage, logistics, and market psychology all at once. Production does not instantly recover. Shipping does not instantly normalize. Infrastructure does not instantly trust peace announcements. Banks do not instantly price routes, like nothing happened, especially not in a corridor that has already proven it can choke the planet. And that is why the phrase ceasefire can mislead you. A ceasefire sounds like calm. A ceasefire sounds like the system can breathe again. But the market hears something colder: delay, repair, verification, risk, residual fear, and every one of those words carries a price. Even now, talks remain uncertain as the truce deadline approaches. So the world is not really pricing peace, it is pricing interruption plus doubt. That means the shock keeps moving, even when the missiles slow down. And that changes everything. Because when enough doubt enters the energy system, governments stop waiting for markets to self-correct. They intervene. The International Energy Agency said this war has triggered the biggest energy crisis in history. Its chief said the shock surpassed 1,973, 1979, and 2022 combined. That is an extraordinary claim. And the response was extraordinary too. A record 400 million barrels were released from strategic reserves across 32 countries. Read that again. The world started defending normal life by opening emergency stockpiles. That is what panic looks like when it wears a suit. Not because one country ran out of oil, because one corridor made the entire system look breakable. Because the market no longer believed normal flow could defend itself. That is the spike. You are watching governments spend stored security to preserve the appearance of stability. They are buying time with oil they hoped never to touch. And stored security is finite. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve held about 409 million barrels in April. Its capacity is around 714 million barrels. So even the backup now tells a story. A harder one. The cushion is smaller than the headline. The reserve is real, but not bottomless. The system can absorb pressure, but not endlessly. And that matters because reserves solve interruption differently than confidence. They can release barrels. They cannot force trust back into the route. And once that becomes visible, markets start thinking beyond the present crisis. They start asking a more dangerous question. What happens the next time this route is threatened? What happens when the next crisis begins with less spare protection. Because this war is not just producing shortages. It is producing memory. Governments remember which routes failed. Traders remember which assumptions broke. Allies remember who could not guarantee passage. Rivals remember how little force was required to shake the world. Insurers remember which sea lanes suddenly became political liabilities. That is where power shifts, not only on maps, inside expectations, inside pricing, inside future planning. Iran does not need to conquer oceans to matter here. It only needs to prove that a narrow waterway can become leverage. That is already enough to change diplomacy, because leverage changes negotiations even before it changes borders. Gulf states are now worried that talks could cement Tehran's grip over Hormuz rather than remove it. That is a brutal sentence, because it means the war may end without ending the leverage. It means the route itself could remain haunted even after the truce. And if leverage survives, then the crisis survives inside the system. Even if missiles stop, even if cameras leave, even if politicians start using calmer language, even if markets try to pretend the danger has passed. That is why the struggle here is larger than oil itself. It is about whether the world still controls the routes it depends on, or whether it merely rents passage through them until the next crisis. And once that question opens, other questions follow. Can Europe endure another long energy shock after Ukraine already strained its resilience? Can Asian buyers diversify fast enough without paying far more for security? Can navies truly secure commerce when fear itself has become a weapon? Can emergency reserves keep masking a system designed around vulnerable choke points? Can states protect trade if private insurers stop trusting the route first? Those are not future problems. Those are present conditions. India, for example, moved towards sovereign guarantees for insurers as risks intensified. The plan involved a $1.5 billion sovereign guarantee fund and a $300 million industry pool. That tells you something important. States are no longer only defending territory. They are defending insurability. They are defending the basic conditions that keep commerce moving at all. Because if a route cannot be insured, it cannot function normally. If it cannot function normally, prices stop behaving normally. If prices stop behaving normally, politics stop behaving normally. If politics stop behaving normally, every response starts getting more expensive. And then the shock jumps again. The European Union is moving to widen sanctions against those who block Hormuz. That sounds like punishment. But it is also admission. Admission that the corridor has become a strategic battlefield in its own right. Not a side effect, not an afterthought. A battlefield where law, finance, and shipping all collide. And once a trade route becomes a battlefield, every cargo becomes a calculation. How long can it sail? Who will insure it? What if it is delayed? What if it is hit? What if the ceasefire fails? What if the price gap widens again? What if the next threat is enough without a single missile landing? This is why food enters the story, because energy does not stay inside energy. More expensive fuel means more expensive transport. More expensive transport means more expensive inputs. More expensive inputs mean pressure on agriculture, manufacturing, packaging, and retail. It means colder margins for businesses already under strain. It means households pay for disruption they never caused. That is how a waterway in the Gulf enters a supermarket thousands of kilometers away. Not dramatically, quietly, then all at once. That is how systems usually hit ordinary life. This is also why the conflict feels hard to price. Reported more than $50 billion worth of crude had not been produced after roughly 50 days of war. And still, the aftershock may last months or years, because systems like this rarely snap back cleanly. They leave residue behind. Damage lingers. Repairs take time. Insurance habits harden. Stockpiles shrink. Trust recovers last. And trust is what the market is actually starving for. That is the second spike. The world is not just losing oil. It is losing confidence in its own ability to keep flows normal. It is losing the assumption that global trade can stay efficient under pressure. And confidence is one of the least replaceable resources in a global system. Once it cracks, everything gets heavier. Risk gets heavier. Shipping gets heavier. Diplomacy gets heavier. Growth gets heavier. Every decision carries more friction than before. Even cautious decisions start looking risky inside a system like this. That is what people mean when they say modern stability looks fragile. Not that it vanishes in one night, that it starts requiring emergency action simply to appear normal, that it must be defended constantly just to look routine. And that is the real image of this war. Not only smoke over targets, not only maps and flags, not only statements from capitals, but tankers waiting, insurers retreating, governments opening reserves, buyers paying more, households absorbing costs they never voted for. A regional war pressing on a global choke point until the whole world starts leaning. And the worst part is not that this system was weak. It is that the world already knew where the weak points were. It knew the route, it knew the concentration, it knew the consequences of disruption. Hormuz was never hidden. The dependence was never hidden. The concentration was never hidden. What was hidden was how little disruption would be needed. Not full closure, not total collapse, just enough pressure in the right place, just enough fear in the right market, just enough delay across the right route, just enough uncertainty to make the system punish itself. And suddenly, the illusion of resilience starts draining away. That is the aftermath now taking shape. Not collapse in one flash, erosion in real time. Modern stability still rests on a handful of narrow passages, a few routes, a few assumptions, a few promises that look solid until a war tests them. And this war has tested them hard. Hard enough for the IEA to call it the biggest energy crisis in history. Hard enough for 32 countries to release record stockpiles. Hard enough for insurers, markets, and governments to start behaving like normality is already expensive. Hard enough to show that resilience may be thinner than the language around it. So the question is no longer whether one narrow waterway matters. The question is what else the world still depends on this way. What other route still looks ordinary until pressure reveals its real power? What other system still looks global, diversified, modern, and resilient? What other seam is already carrying more weight than it can survive? Until one war touches the seam and the world starts crashing through it.